Join us in a festival that promises to be extraordinary, because Bali is extraordinary.
Hi everyone, welcome to Ubud Writers and Readers Festival 2021. This year, the festival returns with the theme Mulat Sarira, self-reflection, which is drawn from a Balinese Hindu philosophy. From October 8 to 17, we will explore the meaning of self-reflection, cultural introspection, and human rights, examining who we are, what unites and divides us, and what drives our actions. My name is Cynthia Dewi Oka. I am an Indonesian American poet, and I am so excited to have the opportunity to speak with Ada Limón today. I feel like my personal experience with Ada's poetry is actually very aligned with the theme of this year's UWRF, in that I have felt such generosity and invitation to self-reflect. There's a deep lyrical intelligence in Ada's work that is also emotional and lived. And I think definitely as an immigrant woman, as a woman of color, that's something that's been really important to me. It's like the lived aspect of it, in that these are wise, sagacious, challenging, even when her poems wrestle with anger, with difficult situations. I mean, we live in a difficult world. There's an insistence to being in the world, being a part of the world, that has been very powerful for me to experience. So with that, Ada Limón is the author of 6 books of poetry, including The Carrying, here, which won the National Book Critics Circle Award for Poetry. Her book, Bright Dead Things, was nominated for the National Book Award, the National Book Critics Circle Award, and the Kingsley Tufts Poetry Award. Her work has been supported most recently by a Guggenheim Fellowship. She grew up in Sonoma, California, and now lives in Lexington, Kentucky, where she writes, teaches remotely, and hosts the critically acclaimed poetry podcast, The Slowdown. Her new book of poetry, The Hurting Kind, so look out for it, is forthcoming from Milkweed Editions in May 2022. So it's going to be a really good spring next year for us all. Welcome, Ada.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here, and thank you for that wonderful introduction.
Of course. So, I mean, let's just get into it. I really want to hear how you're doing, and if there are things that have been living in your heart and mind during these recent times.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. I feel like we don't ask each other enough how we're doing, especially right now, right? It's like on to the next thing. And I think I'm like most people, sort of very up and down, where it feels like 1 minute the ground is firm underneath me, and the next minute everything gets pulled out. And I'm suddenly wobbly again. So I feel like I'm going like this. And I just sort of kind of hope at some point it starts to be like, okay, I got this. So I'm feeling in some ways a little more grounded than I have been. And then in other ways, a little more challenged. I think I'm very lucky, like you are, to have poetry in my life to kind of feel like an anchor when everything feels like it's an unmooring force.
Right. Do you find that inside of this period of flux that you were just naming, that your practice has evolved, or like does it change in relationship to that?
Yeah, I think I think it's very true. I think it has to change in relationship to this, right? I feel like one of the things, and I don't know if you feel this way, but I feel like there's so many times that we feel like we must write. Um, and I'm very suspicious of that because I do think there are times where we don't need to write, that we need to listen, that we need to nap, that we need to read, that we need to go stare at a tree, that we need to cry. Um, and I feel like so often it's like, oh no, I need to produce this next thing, this next thing. And I feel like one of the good forces right now that's moving within me is that I have completed some new projects, which means I can kind of sit back.
Mm,
And even though I'm feeling like there's a lot going on and I'm doing a lot of things, I don't necessarily feel like I have the drive to the page. And I'm sort of instead absorbing and
mm,
reading and what it is to spend time in other people's poems. And so, in that sense, I think the ebbs and flows of life have really allowed me to sometimes I want to produce and sometimes I want to receive.
right. I really love the way you describe, because it made me think of mulching.
Mm.
It's just like, okay, like maybe rain will come, maybe other leaves will fall on top of me, maybe birds will land, or like maybe I'll just overhear conversations. But I think absolutely, like there's this, I almost feel like, particularly since the beginning of the pandemic, it's also just this kind of drive to like
Mm.
produce, also become like that, anchor that people are holding on to, which is like the production is different from poetry, if that makes sense.
It absolutely is. And I feel like there's a certain amount also is that when you live in a capitalist world, it feels like it's all about production, production, and not just the making, right? It's about the putting it in the world. It's about the submitting. It's about the publication. And I feel like it's really important to remember that the making and the creating is really where we live as artists. Like that's our space. That's our grounding space.
Right. Thank you so much for sharing that, and speaking about like the making being the place where we live. So there's this phrase in Denise Levertov's The Poet in the World that I read years ago, and I've kind of like returned to it multiple times since. There's this phrase in it that's really stuck with me about how poetry is a way of reconciling with the world. And it's definitely something that comes to mind for me when I read your work. I think that when in that, like, I feel like when I am not able to find the language or the seeing or the listening that allows me to stay,
Mm.
you are a poet I can go to for that, if that makes sense. And I've always been really struck by your willingness to kind of be changed in
Mm.
your poems, and the way that you pay attention to the world, including the things that aren't there, like the absences and the losses and the wishes and the things that don't arrive, which is, certainly something that I really connected deeply with, and the carrying especially.
Mm.
And then you like metabolize it, into like presence. So I would love to hear if you would be willing to share
Mm.
whether or how writing this particular book, The Carrying, changed you.
Yeah, that's a beautiful question and beautiful sentiment. And first, let me say, I love that I am a poet that you go to when you're feeling um, like you need to have that connection because I feel like I'm never necessarily writing for advice or for, reaching out to someone else necessarily.
Mhm.
But I know that I'm writing because I need it, right? I'm writing myself into the world. Writing myself like, okay, what is it to try to praise this thing that I may not want to praise,
Right.
or to interrogate something that I might not even want to question. And I think that that act especially in the carrying, um, has become not just who I am as a writer, right? Who I am as an artist and what I do as an artist, but I think it has a lot to do with my life, with how I live. And I think that it's not that I necessarily find answers, right? It's not that I go, oh, okay, I've solved it. I've figured it out. It's much more that I can walk away feeling like, oh, now I know what the questions are. And I'm more comfortable with the questions. And that they may not ever go away. But when it comes up, I go, oh, I know you. I've seen you before. You and I we have a history.
Right.
And I think that's really essential for just the way I am in the world, which is instead of feeling kind of attacked by the self, which is, I feel like, a way that we can often feel, I'm at peace with it and know when those things come up that they're familiar to me and they're sort of the makings of me, as opposed to combating them. So I definitely feel changed by the work about writing. I think that there are times where I won't publish until I'm very comfortable with the subject matter. I know that in the carrying, I probably took 15 poems that I wasn't ready to publish, and it wasn't until I was really ready to realize that I was not going to have a child, and that I was comfortable with that I was able to put those poems in the world. And partly that was also because I wasn't prepared for the advice that is offered out there, and that sort of, it's beautiful and it always comes out of a good place, but I had gotten a lot of that. And so I think I needed to have had and made a decision for myself that when the book came out, when those poems came out, in particularly that dealt with infertility, that I was comfortable in my decision that we were going to be child-free.
Right. I love this idea of like, it's almost like you gave yourself the space and time and opportunity to go through the trials that you needed to for having a sovereign relationship, like for it to become, because I don't know, I think that's something that is really hard and this is something, like part of the reason it's so close to me, the way that you've written about this, is because it's something I have gone through as well. And it's something that's very difficult to talk about. It's exactly like a bunch of like unsolicited advice, like in your direction. And then there's like, I don't know, because of like the way femininity, motherhood, like they all get kind of bound up. It's like, there's judgment, there's pity, sometimes like that. I'm like, even when it's like unintentional, like if like I read it into the good intentions, if that makes sense. And kind of and I'm still like, I feel like this book really gave me permission to like enter into a space of like, okay, like I need to create my own sovereign relationship to this loss, because it is a loss. And at the same time, I think for a long time, I didn't realize, or like, I didn't know what it meant to decide how I would respond to it, that's a form of sovereignty too.
Yes. And that making those decisions, that there is always a decision too. I think that there's so much, I love how you're using the word sovereignty here, because I feel like there is so often everything feels like outside of our control, especially as a woman in this world. And I feel like there is a certain amount of taking that back. And I think with the poems in this book, a lot of it was trying to create that space. Like, what is this space for complication? What is this space for not being wholeheartedly perhaps interested in being a mother? And then what is the space for being wholeheartedly interested in it and then thinking it may not happen? I mean, I think one of the things I love about poetry, and I'm sure you feel the same way, and it sounds like you do, is that it creates this space for complexity. It creates this space for that we don't have to have a duality. You're either a mother or a non-mother. You're either this or that or this or that. You know, you're either male or female. I mean, we have all of these things that are living within us and moving. And poetry exists in those edges. It exists in all of those in-between spaces. And I think because of that, it makes sense to kind of go to it as a reader, right? When you need something that's not like offering wisdom. And then also go to it as a writer when you need to maybe create that space. Like, what is this little corner that I can make sense out of, right? And even maybe not make sense out of, but can kind of create that's maybe a little bit safe for me to breathe in for a moment. And I think that was a big part of making this book, was creating that sovereign space that felt like I can be safe within this. And in some ways, when I held off on publishing, it was part of that, because I didn't know if I was ready for it was still, I had a reader in mind, but I wasn't sure if I would ever send out those books. I just didn't know. And so I let myself be like, these may just be for myself. And what does a poem look like if you only write it for yourself? If you were thinking this may just go in a drawer and stay there,
Right. It just struck me like literally where you were talking that I was, it's like the book carried you.
Yeah.
You made a book to carry you. And that's like the flip side of the title. And to follow up on that, I think, so there is this kind of shimmering loss in the book. And the very active presence of dreams.
Yes.
It was like a counterbalance. And I was just like, these dreams are so protagonistic. Can you talk a little bit about, just what dreaming means for your practice?
I love that you bring that up. I think dreams are really essential for me, not only in my creative work, but just in my living life. And I think that I'm always learning a lot from them. I'm always like, it feels to me like it doesn't feel like an imaginary world. It feels to me like just another world that I enter into when I go to sleep. And it feels as real as anything. And it's where we spend a lot of our lives in those dreams. So I'm always trying to remember them. I'm always trying to really look at them and see what they're offering me, because I feel like there's so much there. Even in the scary ones, even the ones that feel like, oh, that was just sort of sadness, but if you're a poet and or a painter or an artist of any kind, we're obsessed with images, right? We love that Technicolor image. And then here we have this whole life that if we can really, get ourselves to remember those dreams, that comes back. Those images are there. Here we think we have to work for a metaphor. And then we've got this entire dream life that is there and presenting these intricate, colorful, vibrant metaphors and similes and, flourishing language for us. And I feel like that's just, I don't know. I feel like it's an untapped resource for us. My dog just joined us, by the way.
Oh, hi.
I feel like I'll also say about the dream poems was that in 2015, I was quite sick with what they think it was vestibular neuritis, but it was chronic. So I had vertigo for really on and off for about 5 years. It's since been much better, but I had lots of tests and MRIs and trying to figure out. At one point we thought it was like a brain bleed or all of these sort of scary things that someone says off the sort of off the cuff, and then you have to go sit with that for a little while on the subway. But I didn't know how to write because I was so used to, and we say this, right? Or even if you meditate, it's like we go, oh, like let's, return to the body. And I kept thinking when I write, I return to the body. When I meditate, but I was like, what if your body is actually not feeling like the safest place to return to? Like, what do you do if your body actually feels like it's betraying you a little bit? And I didn't know how to do that. And I knew I needed to write, not out of sort of producing, but just because I felt like I was sort of stuck and I needed to dislodge something. And so I gave myself a project, which was to deeply remember my dreams as much as I could, and then to turn them into poems. And that my goal was that all of the things that happened in the dream, like they didn't have to be in the poem, but everything that was in the poem had to be true to the dream, that I wasn't going to add anything. So that they're all real dreams. But I could add language, right? I could make the language more poetic, if you will.
Right.
And I did that for almost 45 nights, I think, in a row.
Wow.
And these were the few poems that I trusted enough to put in the book. But yeah, there's many more. And that really, really helped me, because not only did it remind me that I could write without necessarily feeling my best self. I didn't have to be a healthy, able-bodied person necessarily in order to write. But also there was an escape for suffering, which was the subconscious, right? The dream world. And then also that you could make poems, that you had all of this material there, that it wasn't about, you didn't have to go out. Like at that point I couldn't really walk. So, I didn't have to go out and have all these experiences in order to make art. And so it's something I really cherished. And I tell people that a lot, if they're feeling like in a bad way, to return to those dreams, because it was an exercise that if for any reason I get laid up again, I will absolutely do. It was a type of freedom I hadn't experienced before.
I'm so
I'm
struck.
really glad you brought that up, by the way.
Uh-huh.
I said, I'm really glad you brought the dream poem.
Oh, yes. I'm so struck by this experience that you just shared, because it just like, I'm like, our dreams are our bodies too.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, duh. And it's true. I mean, my mom like had vertigo for years, and it was very, very difficult for her to trust. Like, she was like, I don't know if I can stand up.
Yeah.
I don't know, like, if the distance between myself and the door right now is correct. Like, it's so disorienting. And I think that a lot we live in a culture that, dreams are like supposed to be these like mysterious things that like we interpret. And I feel like that was also something that was different in this book. I was like, this is not like, you were not analyzing these dreams. And you know what I mean? It's like, this boy and drowning means this. Like, it's like, that's not what happened.
Right.
It was like witnessing and being in them, and like letting yourself live in them, and then inviting us to like live in them. And it's such a completely different approach.
I love that you say that, because that was a big part of what I wanted to risk, was to not add anything, not to say, because I mean, really, all you have to do is start telling a dream, and pretty soon you go, oh, I think I know what that means.
Right.
So you don't really need to analyze them, because all you need is the image. And then it can be complete on its own.
Yes, it's like the same attention that we should pay, like Rilke did with the panther in the cage. Same degree of like noticing for dreams. And I feel like there's like this, dreams populate the book. They are alive in the book. And then another counterweight to the shimmering loss. Like, it's just really like how I think about it. And it's like I see this like silver line is relationships. There's so many relationships that you like interrogate in the poem, in the poems in this book, with your mother, partner, mentors, community, ancestors, and then also like plants and animals. And they are like held together and by like the eye, right? And I wanted to ask you, because like I'm teaching, a lot of us teach poetry, and like we're always talking about the speaker, the speaker, which is like not necessarily the poet or the you, but I'd love to hear how you think about that I and like inside of the context of those relationalities. Like, do you think about it as like a separate speaker from yourself, or?
Right. I love that you asked that. I have, I think that in graduate school, we're taught like, oh, we always say the speaker, even in undergraduate, the speaker of the poem. And I do think that's a protection. Like, I love it. I mean, it protects us as an artist. It protects us from someone saying, oh, so you're infertile, whatever you could say, the speaker,
Right.
the speaker.
Right.
We can have these sort of moments that protects us. Right. And I completely get it. And I think it's necessary on a lot of levels. But I think as an artist, I had to free myself from that construct because I actually needed to be less protected in order for me to get at what I needed to get at. So I think starting with Bright Dead Things, kind of let the speaker go. I just let it go. I'm not I'm the speaker is me. And it felt like that didn't mean necessarily that I had to be the center of the story, though.
Yes.
Right?
Right.
Because I feel like that's something that we're always thinking about, is that the I then must be, the center, must be what everything revolves around. And I'm interested in what it is to have the I that still is decentered, that still becomes like what it is to let the tree be the subject, or the dog be the subject, or the partner be the subject, or something that's beyond, so that you're still saying, yes, there's a person here behind this. But it's not the most important thing. I think that I used to believe that if you're using the I, it's because I am the most important thing. And I don't believe that. I don't believe that. And I also think that part of just the way I live is in that sort of that we're all in relationship to one another, that I am in no way more important than the next person, the next animal. And I think that in order to live in that kind of community or reciprocity with the world, I think that I have to, in some ways, also take ownership over the work. Yeah. Right? Because speaker was no longer something I could maybe hide behind.
Yes.
So a speaker also maybe gave me an authority that I didn't have or want. So I stripped that away in some ways so that it was more human. And that's how I think, for me, I moved forward with that ongoing question, that duality of speaker and I.
I love that. I think that to me, the perfect poem that exemplifies what you were just saying is the poem about your mother with the umbrella.
Yeah, the raincoat. Yeah.
Yes, the raincoat and the storm, because it starts off with this little girl who is going, the speaker, you going through these treatments as a child, and and then it shifts. Like, there's this turn, and I was so surprised by like where the poem, and it was really like a gut punch. I was just like, oh my God, I have to like rethink everything about my mother. But I just wanted to like uplift that, because I love that poem so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's important to interrogate those things too. Because I mean, decentering the I is not just a creative process, right? That's a lifelong endeavor. And I think, what does that do for us? Like, what it does is have like interrogate our relationships and also how we value one another, and recognize the work of others, so that it's not always like, I'm busy, I'm this, I'm that, what is this person doing? Why have I not tuned into this person? And the idea of asking, even that simplicity, we talk about this all the time, but like asking how you are, right? And expecting to listen, to actually being with the answer, versus a nicety, or, an act of, just an act of the typical, how are you? Fine, etc.
Right. Like, where it's like procedural.
Yeah, exactly.
We get to the thing that we want to say.
Yeah,
Right?
exactly.
Hey, how are you? And we like eliminate from ourselves the opportunity to, I don't know, for wonder, because I really feel like with so many poems in this book, there was like another one that I think of often about like how the leaves shake and then we all stand straighter
Mm.
after that. It's just like there's these moments of just deep attention where exactly that, like the eye is there, the eye takes responsibility for seeing the world, but then like puts itself in service of seeing the world and like of seeing these human beings in it and like all beings in it. So
Yeah.
yes, just incredibly masterful collection that is, and I mean that in the sense of also like self-mastery, if that makes sense. And I'm really, really thankful to have experienced it. Are there works by other poets or artists that you have been returning to or discovering that have been resonant in this time of?
Yeah, I feel like there's a wonderful question, and as you probably read like I do, which is everything, and I always have about like 20 books stacked next to my bed, and
Yeah.
I mean I have stacks; they're just everywhere. I need to get new shelves. But I think that a couple of the books, a few that I can just name off the top of my head, and I'm staring at them because they're one of those you've been carrying around with me, and that's the Collected Audre Lorde. I think that has been a huge wonder for me during this time, and I don't know what it is, but I think it's because she has this amazing way of complicating the relationship towards between sensuality and also suffering. So I'm very intrigued by what she does with the body as well as what she does with the observation of the natural world. Yeah, I just a stunning all-time favorite poet. And then, of course, the other person I would mention, just because she's part of this book for me, which is Natalie Diaz's Post-Colonial Love Poem, which is an exceptional poem, and of course, it won the Pulitzer Prize this year. And these poems, there's a lot of these poems that wouldn't exist without our friendship and kinship and connection through the line and through the heart. And then I think the last one I'll mention is the Argentinian poet Alejandra Pizarnik. There's a book, Extracting the Stones of Madness, that's translated by Yvette Siegert. It's really quite beautiful. It's out by New Directions. And that book, I think I've gone to just completely immerse myself in many, many times. And a lot of what I am drawn to her, and why I'm drawn to her, is that she herself deals with such sadness and gloom, if you will. But then she has this poem about basically how she's kind of getting out of it, and very attuned to the musicality of the world. It's masterfully translated as well. So it's beautiful.
Okay, I'm gonna have to check that out.
Yeah.
You have evangelized effectively. And I love that you also I taught post-colonial love poems at my poetry class last semester, and we had so many rich discussions about it. And Audre Lorde, obviously I remember for I don't know, the majority of my 20s I had her collection, Sister Outsider, and then afterwards For a Well Black Unicorn. I just carried it around in my purse everywhere. It was like my protection from the world.
Yeah.
And myself. So I love that, she's a poet that we've been returning to.
Yeah, I find I think that she's getting sort of a second life now, but I still feel like even in graduate school, it wasn't like many people are reading her or discussing her, or they were reading essays and not the poetry.
Right.
And I feel like that sometimes happens with her, that it's like, oh, read these essays. Same thing with Muriel Rukeyser, who I think is a phenomenal poet, but most people they'll often be like, oh, the life of poetry, and look at Muriel Rukeyser's essays. And I think that we have to remember that they're poets.
Yes, that they were first makers.
Yes.
And I think Audre Lorde, Audre Lorde in particular, like I think like her poetry was so far, it's like of the future.
Yeah.
She was so interested also in kind of like dismantling time and like again like looking at the natural world at a moment where I don't know, where I felt like, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but like I feel like in a moment where so much of what was perceived as like American poetry was like the confessional poetry, she was like working in another direction. It was like an unpeeling of her life, but it wasn't but formally it was not at all. She was not using the same forms.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I feel like she's also doing that work of what it is to be both subject and receiver, right? Like
Right.
that to be like, I want to be listening and watching and I want to, to have that experience of being a delight at being fully human on the page.
Right.
Without necessarily always having to come in with the I and then let me tell you about this, right? There's a lot of musicality in the language also that I think is overlooked.
Yes. So Ada, with that, I would like to congratulate you. Speaking of musicality, I would like to congratulate you on succeeding Tracy K. Smith as the host of the Slowdown. That's so incredibly, exciting. And she actually calls you on the cover of your book a poet of ecstatic revelation. And I wonder if you can briefly, because I also would love to hear you read a poem before we close out. If you can share with us what you think about that, what your relationship is to ecstasy, and like what your vision is for the podcast's next stage.
Yeah, I thank you so much. It has been such an honor to work on it so far. An amazing producer, Jennifer Lai, who's just phenomenal, and a poet. So it's been just a joy. And I was a little worried about the amount of work it was going to be, as you might imagine, as anyone would imagine. It's not a small amount of work. And I'm just I had written to Tracy before and I said, what do you think? Can I do this? And she's like, you can do this. And she was so supportive and I adore her as a poet and as a human being. And I think what I want for the Slowdown at least is, first of all, of course, to follow in her huge, beautiful footsteps, but also to, I think we're so often feeling like we need to have a master's degree in poetry in order to enjoy poetry. And I just think that is so untrue.
Yeah.
I grew up where poetry was read in bars and read, like this, it was much more of a community thing.
Right.
And I'm hoping that the Slowdown will kind of be that, will be that return to that sort of community, that it's about the language, that it's about listening. It doesn't have to be about dissecting it or being like, whoa, this poem means this, right? That it can just be like a short sort of moment of like, oh, right. Poetry right there, right then made some kind of sense and moved me and maybe just brought you back to the world a little bit. So that's my hope.
I love that. I can't wait. I'm so excited. So to close out, I think we may have 5 minutes around left, and I would love to hear you read.
Yeah.
And
well, since you brought up this poem, maybe I should read The Raincoat.
Oh, thank you. Yes, please.
So this is a poem I wrote for my mother. And I'll just start that I do have somewhat severe scoliosis. And so I've done a lot of back work in my life. I have lots of, wonderful people who work on me and try to get me to stand straight and all those things. But it began with my mother. The Raincoat. When the doctor suggested surgery and a brace for all my youngest years, my parents scrambled to take me to massage therapy, deep tissue work, osteopathy, and soon my crooked spine unspooled a bit. I could breathe again and move more in a body unclouded by pain. My mom would tell me to sing songs to her the whole 45-minute drive to Middle Two Rock Road and 45 minutes back from physical therapy. She'd say that even my voice sounded unfettered by my spine afterward. So I sang and sang because I thought she liked it. I never asked her what she gave up to drive me or how her day was before this chore. Today, at her age, I was driving myself home from yet another spine appointment, singing along to some maudlin solid song on the radio. And I saw a mom take her raincoat off and give it to her young daughter when a storm took over the afternoon. My God, I thought, my whole life I've been under her raincoat, thinking it's somehow a marvel that I never got wet.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for all these marvelous questions.
Yes, it was such a deep pleasure and like a dream come true. So I thank you again so much, and I wish you the very, very best in this next year. I can't wait for the new book next spring.
Yes.
Yes, you want to actually say a few words about that?
Yeah, sure. I'd be delighted if we have time. Yeah.
Have a few minutes.
Okay. Yeah. The new book is called The Hurting Kind, and it's that the title poem is in the rumpus. Actually, you can look it up. But I have the manuscript here, and you'll see my husband gave it an A+. So
that's so sweet.
So that's high quality stuff. We've got an A+. And I'm very excited also because my mother, who I just read the poem about, she's done the covers of all my books, and she's done the new cover as well. And it's a little different. It's not as bright. It's got a little dark quality to it. And I think they're going to reveal it in October. And it's so beautiful. I love it so much. So yeah, the book is about sort of interconnectedness again. It's about ancestors. It's big on ancestors. Very much a book of animals and plants as well. And I think, I kept trying to figure out what it was that was making it keep returning to me. I was like, I think this is a book. And I realized it's about the fact that all of these things are my relations, right? Like it's not just the community of humans, but the community of trees and the community of what surrounds us and the animals too. So yeah, I'm very excited about it. It's I don't want to say it's heavy. I mean, it's not, I think the carrying was pretty heavy. I think in this way, it's a little more, it has solitude in it. And I think any of us who've been going through the pandemic just know that we've gotten very familiar with our solitude.
Yeah. And to teach ourselves with, I think like that's the wonderful thing about your poetry. It's like a guide, also like teaching ourselves to remind ourselves of the relationships, because it's like it feels like that's what we forgot. I think I forgot that this year, that like there is a planet, because I've been so like caught up in the the human existential crisis. And like I think that directionality. Thank you. I cannot wait. Everyone that is Ada Limón, please check out her books and get ready for the next one. I cannot speak highly enough of The Carrying. And thank you also for supporting the Yayasan Mudra Swati Saraswati Patrons Program, and to the festival partners who made the Ubud Writers and Readers Festival possible. You can follow Ubud Writers Festival on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, or visit ubudwritersfestival.com for more information about our program. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.